When the colonies learned that the Stamp Act of 1765 had become law, they were faced with three choices as to how to respond. And we'll go through these three choices here. The first choice was submission. The second choice was conservative. And the third choice was civil disobedience. Now we'll go through each of these options in order. The colonists' first option would be to submit to the law and to find ways to live under the law. Well, as we saw when we talked about what the Stamp Act actually entailed and what it consisted of, this was not truly tenable for the colonists if they wanted to live as free and independent people. The law literally stretched into several different facets of their lives and made things a lot harder economically and practically in many different forms. And so submission would mean a life under very great hardship, and it would require basically dulling their spirit of self-determination and independence in order to live peacefully under what the British government demanded. The second option would have been conservative, which largely would have consisted of basically avoiding transactions where the Stamp Act would have applied. But again, as we saw when we discussed all these different areas where the Stamp Act reached into, this was not tenable either. The Stamp Act simply reached into too many aspects of American colonial life. Remember, the people who had created the Stamp Act, who had designed the Stamp Act, had worked off of advice given to them by certain local government officials in the colonies as to where they could successfully apply stamp taxes. And it reached into all facets of life, everything from major documents such as land grants and wills, licenses to practice law, school degrees, college degrees, everything like that, to things as simple as dice and cards that sailors would play with in port. It affected every single aspect of life. No one was going to be unaffected by this. Basically, lawyers couldn't do business if they couldn't transact in these documents that required stamps. Business people could not transact unless they basically used some of these documents and other items that required stamps. And sailors in port couldn't even pass their idle time freely without using stamps on their dice and cards. So basically, the conservative approach was also untenable. The law reached into too many parts of American life. So if they wished to retain their independence and their self-governance, the colonies really only had one option, and that was civil disobedience. They had to defy the Stamp Act in any way, shape, or form that they could. This was not going to be easy, but thankfully for the colonies, because of their long and complicated history with Britain up to this time, where basically they admired certain things about Britain, but they also had basically a tension with Britain because the British ruling class looked down on the Americans who were descendants of people who had fled oppression, largely from the British Isles and Ireland and other parts of Europe. They had fled oppression over to America to start new lives, and the British ruling class still looked down upon these people, and so they had no respect for them. And in turn, the American colonists were always suspicious of government power because they had seen how government power had been used to oppress their ancestors. And so basically, it wasn't as stark a choice as some might look, as it might appear to some. The colonists already had some experience in civil disobedience where this was concerned, but it was going to take civil disobedience on a much larger scale than had been previously practiced in order for opposition to the Stamp Act to be effective. And here's where the response is going to take on great importance.